Evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Freedom Seminar event. This is part of a series that's been going on throughout this semester, and I hope you will come to many others. Tonight's presentation is an unfortunately timely one. The subject of the documentary you're about to see is on trial as we speak for his liberty and faces a potential life sentence for speaking out in defense of freedom. It leads us to ask ourselves, especially if you're born in this country and you have received, through no efforts of your own, a legacy of freedom, what are you willing to do personally to preserve that legacy, to hand that on, to defend freedom? We tend to take it for granted. And I think tonight's film will remind us that we cannot take it for granted. And there are people who are making heroic efforts in defense of liberty around the world. And though they may not be from this country, in a larger sense, they are countrymen. And so I hope that we not only celebrate, but are in some sense inspired and motivated by what we're about to hear tonight. I'm also reminded, of course, that Jimmy Lai, the subject of tonight's documentary, is not the only hero among us who is willing to speak truth in the face of power and in defense of human rights and freedoms. This past week, Alexei Navalny died in prison, a political prisoner for speaking out in his own country of Russia. So these people deserve our respect and our gratitude. And it's because of the efforts of people like our guest tonight, Eric Kohn, that we get to hear about these people, that we can perhaps in our own small way support their efforts. And I'm here to welcome Eric Kohn, who produced tonight's documentary. First, a little bit about Eric. He's the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Acton Institute. And in that role, he works to bring Acton's vision of a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles to a wider audience. He's the producer of the documentary you're about to see, and that was released in 2022. And he is also the executive producer of Acton's podcast network, where he hosts the weekly roundtable podcast, Acton Unwind. He's also a part-time host of Acton Line, its weekly interview podcast. He serves on the board of directors of America's Future, an organization that empowers young people to be active, civil, and curious citizens who build freer communities that lead to fulfillment, dignity, and happiness for all. And he was a leader of the Chicago chapter of that organization for more than 10 years. Prior to joining Acton, Eric was director of community management at the Illinois Policy Institute. He will introduce tonight's film to you. Please welcome producer Eric Kohn.
Well, thank you all so much for being here and for having me here. It was I came from Grand Rapids, but it was an even longer journey as I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning and left Miami in order to fly to Grand Rapids, which was only disappointing in the sense that Miami should have been warmer. This conference that I was at was in California last year, and it was rainy and cold the entire time, and Miami was cold and windy. So in a way, I'm actually glad to be back in Michigan because at least the weather here is what I expect it to be. Very thankful to Northwood and to Dale and all of you for having us here having me here this evening to bring this film to you. I figured I would start by just answering the number one question that I get, which is, why did we want to make this film? Prior to knowing about this event, had any of you heard the name Jimmy Lai before? Neither had I prior to being a producer of this documentary. I got to Acton in 2020, had never heard of him before, and by December of 2020, I knew a lot about him because he had been arrested under the national security law in Hong Kong, which of course you'll see that whole story told in this film. So why do we want to make this film? So I have a good friend who says that for everything that you do in life, there are two reasons. There's the good reason and the real reason. The real reason that we wanted to make this film is because this is a very personal story for us. Our co-founders, Chris Maurin and Father Robert Sirico, who you will see in the film, have been longtime friends of Jimmy's. They've known him for 20-some years. They've visited him in Hong Kong numerous times. In fact, Father Sirico, against the advice of some of us, actually just went over and spent a day at Jimmy's trial. That came at no small risk to himself. We could not in any way guarantee that he was not going to be arrested and detained himself. I guess his calculus was that since he's an American citizen, an Italian citizen, and a Catholic priest, he figured the Chinese didn't want to get three sovereign entities pissed off at them simultaneously. So they let him attend a day of Jimmy's trial just a few weeks ago. So it's a very personal story for us, one that we felt compelled and in a unique position to tell because we'd known him for so long. A lot of the interview footage that you'll see of him in this film is from a film that we released 15 years ago called The Call of the Entrepreneur, where Jimmy talks about coming from China to Hong Kong, building the businesses he built in Hong Kong. So because we had all of that available to us, like, okay, we're in a unique position to do this. The good reason, as well as the real reason being a good reason, the good reason we wanted to make this is because I think we need stories of heroes like this. As Dale was saying, you know, the death of, well, I don't even know that we should say death, the execution of Alexei Navalny, political dissidents like Jimmy Lai, like Alexei Navalny, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, some who have died in the name of their cause, others who have suffered greatly for it, I think are the kind of stories that we need. We need stories of heroes. We need stories of people who are willing to do exceptional things, because I imagine many of you will feel the same way that I do every time I watch this film, which is I don't know that I could do what Jimmy Lai is doing. I don't think most people could do what Jimmy Lai is doing. It takes exceptional people to do the kind of thing that he has been willing to do. And it takes something to sustain him. For Jimmy, in his case, it is his faith. It is his faith that also informs, as our work at the Acton Institute does, a commitment to freedom, which is why he's willing to sacrifice so much for what he believes in. So I think we need stories like this to inspire us, not because we'll ever find ourselves in a situation like Jimmy is, because most people never will. And there, by the grace of God, go all of us. We should all pray that we never have to encounter anything like what Jimmy is going to encounter. But I think the lessons that we can draw from it are the moments where we can act courageously in the way that Jimmy is, that we aren't cowed into either saying things that are untrue or not saying anything at all because we perceive the cost to be too high. And we can remind ourselves of people who have paid a much bigger price in the name of speaking truth to power, speaking out for the cause of human freedom. So I look forward to talking with you after the film. Really, again, very appreciative of all of you being here. Thank you again for inviting me, and we'll go to the film now. Thank you.
There's a saying in Chinese, 寧鳴而死，不鳴而生. If you're a bird, you'd rather die singing than living a silent life.
I don't have a sense of fear. especially if I know I'm doing the right thing.
It's always worth looking back at people who have stood against oppressive regimes.
People emerge. People like Jimmy Lai.
He's a legend. Jimmy's story isn't really his story. That is the story of Hong Kong.
I came here with $1.
Someone who found refuge in Hong Kong and made something from scratch, from nothing.
One country, two systems.
We lose our freedom, we lose everything.
He really sounded a warning for the free world.
Human freedom is really a tapestry of individual freedoms, and they live or die together.
We've never had a territory of 7.5 million people who have lived and breathed their basic freedom and human rights, having that taken away from them.
Hong Kong isn't just about a city, it's about Hong Kongers, it's about the people who live there.
Today, we see this total crackdown on dissent, total crackdown on the civil society in Hong Kong, total crackdown on freedom in Hong Kong.
He chose to stay in Hong Kong.
This is a time for sacrifice.
You can break their body, but you're not going to break their spirit.
A man's back has got to be bent in the process, is what I think Martin Luther King once said.
This guy is like in the suit walking towards the flamethrower, and he's got eating an ice cream cone. And what they don't understand is the point made by Nelson Mandela, that you can't look up an idea.
I watched this man willingly give up the life of a billionaire to become a dissident.
They want to eradicate the symbol of Hong Kong people.
I will have to fight to the last day.
Well, I was born in 48.
He's Chinese. He loves being Chinese.
Well, we were unfortunate because our family was rich family. So naturally, when you're rich, you become the enemy of the people.
His father was a successful businessman, but they lost all that when he was a kid.
Mao Zedong was a brutal dictator, arguably the worst in the 20th century, even compared to Hitler. And arresting thousands and millions of people.
His family's home and their wealth was stripped away from them. He found himself working on the street.
My mother was at labor camp. We were just 5 or 6, and we were managing ourselves without an adult in the household.
So he did not grow up with any advantages. He's basically self-educated.
It was a very confused time for a kid. I didn't know what was going on. We just have to survive, struggle as a kid. When I was 8 and 9, I worked in the railway station, carrying people's baggage. Working gave me the privilege to access people who come from outside, how well they dress, how well they speak, and how well they treat us. One day I was carrying the baggage for a guy. After he gave me some tips, he fell into his pocket and gave me a bar of chocolate. I was so hungry, I turned and I bite. And it was so tasteful. It was amazing. So I turned and I asked him, "Where are you from?" He said, "Hong Kong." I said, "Hong Kong must be heaven because I never taste anything like that." That triggered my determination to go to Hong Kong to escape. I was put in the bottom of the fishing trunk together with maybe 100, maybe 80, I don't remember. And everybody vomiting because,
Jimmy Lai was a stowaway from China at age 12.
At that time, when you arrive in Hong Kong, you touch base. You're legalized.
He arrived in this colonial city with nothing.
And the same night, I was taken to a factory to work as an object worker.
Well, I just remember the first day I went for breakfast, and I never saw so many things for breakfast. And I was so moved. I was crying.
To come into Hong Kong for a Chinese, especially at that time when Jimmy came, that's like going from Kansas in black and white to Oz, where everything seems like it's possible.
Hong Kong has no natural resources. It's basically a pile of rocks in the South China Sea.
Part of it had been acquired in perpetuity after the Opium Wars in the early part of the 19th century. But the largest part of it, the so-called New Territories, had been acquired on a 99-year lease.
It had been really a fishing village up into that time. It was just a regular colonial outpost. You couldn't say that Hong Kong was much different than really any place else in Asia where the Brits were. But after World War II, Hong Kong became a destination for immigrants, and they were Chinese immigrants.
The British did not give us democracy.
They didn't have full freedom under British colonial rule.
But British gave us all the institutions of freedom. The rule of law, the human right, the free speech, the free market. We had all this institution that protect our freedom and let our mind, our resourcefulness flourish. What we eat and sleep in a factory. We had to wake up like before 7 and then we work until like 10 o'clock. But it was a very happy time. It was a time that I know I had a future.
Hong Kong sweats with commerce and opportunity. We talk about free markets, but Hong Kong lives it.
The Brits had this philosophy of laissez-faire. Basically, they ran it much different than they ran their own country at that time.
The then British colonial overseers of Hong Kong cut taxes, cut regulations. It didn't matter if you had some MBA or a college degree. Nobody cared. As long as you wanted to work, you had a good idea, you could learn, you could make it in Hong Kong. Over just a handful of generations, they went from an incredibly poor city to a metropolis that, rivals any of the great metropolises in the world.
The shadow of that was that there were a lot of people that were impacted. I think my most vivid memory was really seeing almost the whole transformation of my childhood neighborhood. Fishing villages being bulldozed and then landfill and then built into multi-million-dollar apartments.
He started as a salesperson for a garment factory. Just sell textile.
I had to go back and forth, bringing samples from Hong Kong to New York.
Partying the night away, are you kidding? That guy, he was a guy who was just on fire in every way. If you wanted to go to a nightclub, Jimmy Lai was the guy to go with. You never touched your wallet. I think part of that wildness was the fact that he was looking for something deeper, that he knew there was something out there.
I was invited to a retired Jewish lawyer's house for dinner. He took a book from the bookshelf and gave it to me and said, read this. And the book's name is called The Road to Serfdom. The book changed my life. It turns the light on for me to see it clearly. It's the result of people's spontaneous reaction and exchange of information and pursuing their own goal that has created the best in the world. And that's very enlightening for me. At the end of that year, I got a bonus. And then I said, okay, look, let's try my luck and speculate in the stock market. If I'm lucky, I make some money, and then I start my own business. And before I knew it, I made $250,000.
I started a very small factory, and eventually we became one of the biggest sweater factory in Hong Kong. I think that the risk-taking is a very important part of being an entrepreneur. And I think that's just came natural after I escaped from China. There's no bigger risk to take than your life.
When Deng Xiaoping came to power after the death of Mao, he really introduced incredible new economic reforms that opened up China's economy.
We want to open up. We want to open up to the world. We want to actually take on reform.
What takes place is arguably one of the most astounding growths of economic prosperity.
And China had this economic miracle.
They went from bicycles and rickshaws to automobiles and what you see today.
I felt the constraint of being a manufacturer.
He's a classic entrepreneur.
And also being a manufacturer for long enough, I was bored. So I thought, maybe retailing is something that I should try. And then I went into retailing, and that business became a phenomenon. That's called Giordano, still surviving.
Giordano was this huge brand.
It was a revolution because it was high quality at a good price.
Affordable fashion, bright. And I remember Giordano always had these great colors.
He named that clothing store Giordano after a pizza parlor.
I took the napkin and then I flew back to Hong Kong. I fell to my pocket. Oh, this is a Giordano. The napkin says Giordano, so I used this name.
Figured an Italian name might sound more like a designer than a Chinese name.
So a business that Jimmy begins in Hong Kong rushes through all of China, and he's making his money in China.
I thought, now China is going to open up. China is going to be changed. China is going to be like Western country that, I've been to, and I was very excited. And I was too optimistic, so to speak. When I first noticed what happened in Tiananmen, I was very moved.
It is not a government by people, of people, for people.
The first step in their long journey to change the Chinese political structure.
Very often people think of Tiananmen as kind of just like a very geographically narrow movement that happened only in Beijing.
But actually, those protests were going on all over China. They represented a real threat to the regime.
Wanted to get involved.
He felt himself to be part of it. He saw this as the Arab Spring for Asia.
So I gave money and print those Tiananmen Square Heroes t-shirt. I had banners in my shop, asked Deng Xiaoping to resign.
And it seems so natural that this brand that you see at every street corner would reflect the aspirations and feelings and desire of everyday Hong Kongers. I marched in the very first million Hong Kongers march back in May of 1989.
People then at the time were thinking that today's Tiananmen, tomorrow's Hong Kong.
That's why millions of Hong Kongers went to the street. They didn't see this as just supporting people in Tiananmen Square. They saw this as their own fate being determined. It was clear that the Tiananmen protest has been, growing, has been expanding. Millions of students and workers and protesters have been in Tiananmen Square.
And it's not one afternoon. It's a period of time where people were gathering and protesting and celebrating. And then the tanks rolled in.
This wasn't a demonstration which got out of hand, so the police had to deal rather toughly with it. This was kids being killed.
Actually, I didn't feel anything about China until Tiananmen Square happened.
He was one of those who was extremely outspoken. No, why do I say outspoken? Honest about what had happened.
All of a sudden, it's like my mother was calling in the darkness of the night. And my heart opened up.
Hong Kong people used to consider themselves being very, very Chinese.
And I think once they saw that, they realized, wait a minute, we're different, and it helped cultivate a distinct Hong Kong identity.
They saw themselves simply as Hong Kongers.
This is freedom gave me.
Everything he has is actually granted by Hong Kong.
I earn freedom, my life.
He want to do something to pay tribute to Hong Kong.
Jimmy never had to work again. He had made plenty of money. He could have retired years and years and years ago, enjoyed a very nice life, but it was about more than that to him.
I asked myself, I make enough money. If I just go on making money, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if I go into the media business, then I deliver information, which is choice. And choice is freedom.
He started a magazine, the Next magazine.
I call it Next because I want my next life, my next business. So 5 years later, we launched the newspaper. The idea came to me to call it Apple.
The Apple Daily newspaper, which was the only pro-democracy Chinese language daily newspaper.
We are the most expensive and by far the #1 newspaper.
And it was fantastically successful. And guess what? It was in favor of freedom and democracy, Apple Daily.
He actually wrote a column every week in the Next magazine, and he wrote something about the premier of the Chinese Communist Party.
I wrote a letter, an open letter to Li Peng, and said some harsh things about him.
I never quite understood Chinese or phrases of abuse, but he called Li Peng things which were regarded as incredibly offensive by Chinese, and he wasn't afraid to do it. So what did they do? They, in effect, closed his business down in China.
One day I was in Paris in the morning, 6:30. I received a call. We were threatened that if I still own the company, they're going to close down the shops in China.
Giordano will not have a future in China if you continue to run your media business.
China offers great riches, but it can also be a trap for a lot of people.
The whole public company will collapse because the greatest potential is in China, and if our doors close there, we finish. We're toast.
He finally got rid of Giordano and just concentrated on his journalism. So Jimmy used to always talk about religion, but like a lot of Chinese, he really didn't have any religion. He was very pro-religion in general, but didn't have any.
Well, my wife is a very devout Catholic, so I went to church for a long time.
Hong Kong was a place where Chinese Christians were freest, in the world.
I think what he found in Teresa was a rock, was a stability, was a reason to see the moral purpose of his life.
I was a bit apprehensive about what's going to happen after the takeover. A lot of people rumor that I will be arrested. Some people will be arrested. I will be this and that. And maybe that kind of security that sets into my psyche that made up my mind to be baptized. Whenever I'm in crisis, I feel I'm going to be okay. I live in grace. And this is what faith gave me.
Leading up to the transition, there was a fatalism to it. People knew the time had come. They knew that the jig was up, as we would say.
There was a real visceral sentiment on the part of Chinese people to be reconciled with Hong Kong.
Here I was, a colonial oppressor, the last colonial governor.
For Hong Kong as a whole, today is cause for celebration, not sorrow.
What made it very difficult was that with virtually every other British colony, you would prepare a country for independence.
Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong.
There'd be a big ceremony and the Queen or a member of the royal family would come and you'd say goodbye and they'd become a member of the Commonwealth. Hong Kong wasn't like that because Hong Kong was never going to become independent. That wasn't part of the deal.
Britain is part of Hong Kong's history, and Hong Kong is part of Britain's history.
And the deal that was done seemed to square the circles in an international treaty.
These qualities in the agreement have been recognised by the British Parliament and by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of China.
It took a mantra of Deng Xiaoping, one country, two systems.
One country, two systems, preserving two different political, social and economic systems within one nation has no precedent.
These were promises that China made that Hong Kong would have its way of life, its basic freedoms, a high degree of autonomy.
Rule of law, accountable government, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association.
It gives Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy. Hong Kong people will administer Hong Kong.
At least for the first 50 years from the time of the handover.
Hong Kong was to stay the same for 50 years after 1997.
I think it was Margaret Thatcher's greatest mistake.
Years after the 1st of July, 1997, I should like to pay a tribute to the leaders of China for the vision and farsightedness of their approach to the negotiations.
The story goes that Thatcher believed that the lease was coming up on Hong Kong, the 99-year lease, and therefore they had to give it back to China. But they didn't have a lease on the island of Hong Kong. They could have kept it, and Margaret Thatcher simply chose not to.
We are confident that the ties between us will not only endure, but will continue to develop.
I hadn't quite realized the extent to which the rest of the world would be watching. And for a lot of European countries in particular, it wasn't just the end, as it were, of the British Empire. It was the end of empire.
We know what it looks like when the British tried to negotiate on behalf and did negotiate on behalf of Hong Kongers and said, don't worry, we got you. And then they walked away.
A toast to the future of Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
I think by and large, reckon it would probably be all right.
In general, there was a sense of optimism that this one country, two systems concept was something that would be abided by.
We were apprehensive at the time, with good reason. And the things we worried about at the time seemed remote, but possible.
If you said, well, how can you trust a communist to keep a free market society? They would say, oh, don't worry. This is the tail, meaning Hong Kong, is going to wag the dog.
Maybe this is going to be okay. Maybe we really will have 50 years of freedom.
As long as we are not pissing off Beijing, we'll be fine. Leave us alone.
To some extent, they were starting from just after 1997 to edge away from what they'd promised.
China was really showing clearly that they had no intention of keeping any of the promises.
They'd promised that people in Hong Kong would be able to determine their own pace of democratization.
But then after the 1997 Hong Kong Pass handover to China, then the Chinese government completely abolished that legislative council.
Even the very first chief executive of Hong Kong, who was, of course, appointed by Beijing in practice, he immediately started to try to constrict the freedoms of Hong Kongers. And the Hong Kongers protested.
The number one eyesore for Beijing was always Apple Daily.
Sometimes you need people to kick your ass in business. I was one of the very few guys who was very controversial, who was very outspoken.
Living in the truth is an effective tool against totalitarian power. Speaking truth to power is something that powerful dictatorships are terrified by.
And I think Jimmy understood that. That's why he started the paper. That's why he kept it. That's why he made it into essentially a part of the movement.
Everybody was so taken out, so scared that they went into self-censorship to avoid offending the communists.
So many businessmen keep quiet because they have investments in China. So Hong Kong people always have a soft spot for a guy willing to speak out, as Jimmy does.
Sit around the table with Jimmy Lai. His ability to get to the core of an issue was just phenomenal.
And actually, he gave me the first advice. He said, you know what, if you are fighting for the free market, if you're fighting for freedom, be prepared to be very lonely.
It was a cool thing to work for the Apple Daily because you can do the stories that you like, that you can do investigative journalism.
I promise that I only criticize what they do after they publish it. So there's no censor.
The journalists of Apple Daily have always been on the front lines trying to report the truth, trying to document the history.
Apple Daily is sharing a different voice. It stands for an option, I think, an alternative.
The existence of Apple Daily really tells that Hong Kong is special because you can not find a newspaper just like Apple Daily in mainland China.
I was thrilled by the idea that, I can be part of the institution that is delivering freedom.
If I deliver information, I'm in the business of delivering liberty.
Standing up for people's rights in Hong Kong and by denouncing Chinese communism and its opposition to the rule of law and democracy.
I believe that if I do the right thing, the strength will come.
I don't know whether he was perfect or not. All I know, he was extremely brave and stood up for all the sort of things which those of us who live in liberal democracies sometimes take for granted.
Xi Jinping, he came to power in 2012, and one of the first things he did was to say that I want to have a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
The leadership of the Communist Party was extremely nervous about the impact of globalization, of urbanization, of the internet.
What ended up happening was this return to a more intransigent ideological view.
Constrain private enterprise, exert much more state control of the economy and of society, in many ways harking back to the days of Mao.
Unfortunately for the Hong Kong people, they went from a colonial but benevolent colonial masters to a regime that was very different in character.
One of the first things that Xi Jinping did, which I'm amazed people don't take more notice of, is they issued a document called Communique Number 9 to party and government leaders, that they had to fight an intense struggle against what were regarded as Western values. Hong Kong's bad luck was that it exemplifies all those Western values in a Chinese form. And that's, I think, why Hong Kong was regarded as an existential threat to Chinese communist rule and leadership.
In the last 2 years, before Hong Kong was handed back to China, the British government actually implemented the universal suffrage for all the seats in the Legislative Council for Hong Kongers.
Universal suffrage, a very basic and fundamental human right.
The system that the British agreed with the Chinese Communist Party gave China and those party leaders the ability to manipulate the elections.
Beijing's proposal was, okay, you could have voted, but
they would get to pick the candidates, and then people could vote for the candidates.
We feel that the most precious thing that make us free people are being taken away.
I think one of the genius of what Jimmy saw from the very beginning was the investment in democratic actions at every level.
They started having an awareness campaign. The leading politicians, Cardinal Zen, Jimmy, Martin Lee, they were marching all over Hong Kong. Some nights, I am not kidding you, you would walk out there and you'd see 6 people walking down the street. Other nights, there'd be 3,000 people marching down the streets. You just never knew what happened. The entire city, the tension was building.
more and more Hong Kong people become more aware of the fact that, hey, we are no longer in control of the city.
They said, we want democracy. We want freedom of speech. We want freedom of the press.
Can we say no to all these ideas from Beijing? Because more and more ideas coming from Beijing.
Something fundamentally changed about Hong Kong. A new generation of people coming to the realization that their particular government, those who claim to represent them, have failed them. For a society, for a city that has no actual democratic political system, protest is a huge part of the DNA of Hong Kongers.
A bunch of school-age kids occupied the government headquarters.
The free institution is all we are so used to, is all that is part of our life is now being destroyed.
And that's why we have to fight.
The protests were getting bigger and bigger. They had taken to the streets.
The whole demonstration, the whole protest was absolutely peaceful. But then all of a sudden, a tear gas bullet was fired by the police.
And I was there actually when they fired the very first tear gas canister.
Now they're using tear gas to disperse a peaceful gathering outside the government headquarters, which was supposed to be a public square. And people saw the scene on TV. Suddenly, all this memory about Tiananmen Square came back.
That's when you saw what Hong Kong was really made at, because literally from all of Hong Kong, people came over.
That then set the stage for what later became the so-called umbrella movement, because the demonstrators used the umbrellas to protect themselves from water cannon and from tear gas and things like that.
We just want the right way up. We have been entitled by the basic law. This is all we ask for.
He went there every day.
Jimmy was attacked a couple of times when he was at demonstrations.
The umbrella revolution kind of failed.
The government that I used to see from the television, from all these newspapers every day, they still decided not to respond to any of these demands.
This was more than just a demonstration or march or rally. In fact, it was never about the outcome of that. It was really about the process of teaching Hong Kongers how to practice democratic actions.
The Chinese communists became really obsessed with one or two people in Hong Kong, people like Martin Lee, Jimmy Lai.
Milton Friedman once said, "There's no free lunches. If I take the stand, I stand." You know, the way that they treat me, whatever they harass me and all that, that's just lunches.
Jimmy Lai and his family are attacked viciously. That family is put through hell. Their children are threatened.
But the intimidation was very multifaceted on Jimmy and on his editors and his reporters.
We feel marginalized. We feel that some pressure. It's just part of the game, and I don't mind it.
24 hours a day, out in front of your house, there's 2 cars full of reporters. They're not really reporters. They're freelancers who report on everybody that comes in and comes out of your house.
And they follow me everywhere I go. And I'm sure when you left our house, they follow you to the hotel and take photo of you. They just want to know who visited us.
It was almost a quarterly thing where we'd have a firebomb thrown. We'd have something done to the house.
But it never prevented him from giving his publications the kind of leeway that they needed and the protection that they needed and the financial support that they needed to continue doing what they did.
If I say this, what is the consequences? If I do this, what's the consequences? I can do nothing. My life is finished. I'm not going to think about this. I just do what's right and go on my life.
By 2019, Beijing had torn down different pillars of Hong Kong's freedom, Hong Kong's civil society. The only thing left was really the legal system.
Up until now, there had been system of the rule of law that you could respect. It was based on the values of our own legal system in the United Kingdom.
That Hong Kong people were still protected by the rule of law, that they would still be protected by the presumption of innocence until proven guilty.
The extradition law was the first attempt to break through that wall.
Essentially, what it would do is it would eviscerate the rule of law in Hong Kong, and it would allow the mainland authorities to take people from Hong Kong over the border into this lawless society, to throw them in jail with no representation and no hope.
We're talking about a city that has actually lived and breathed freedom. And trying to take that away is not that simple.
We all knew that that is the fight of last straw. We have to fight. Otherwise, we will lose everything. If we lose freedom, we will lose everything.
June the 9th, 2019, 1 million people show up.
And then after that 1 million protests, then we have 2 million people.
2 million people in a population of 7.4 participating in massive demonstrations.
How many people do you need to change the mind of this government? If 2 million people is not enough.
The younger generation and the older generation have never been so united.
All of Hong Kong was against that extradition law.
Old, young, middle-aged, students.
Elderly people, people in wheelchairs, young families, blue-collar workers, professionals.
People in finance, the business sector.
In my cigar club, the most pro-Beijing guys I know were against that extradition law because they didn't want to have a business dispute, and then all of a sudden, they get dragged up to Beijing.
Beginning from June 16, another 5 months of protests in different places. Jimmy insists on peaceful protests. We have to show the world that Hong Kong deserves much better than this.
Be Water, I think, emerged as this philosophy.
Everything happens in real time.
This decentralizing of the tactics, of the locations, of the leadership. They developed this linen wall of post-it notes where messages were being crafted and developed and shared freely all over Hong Kong.
Be Water, fluid.
People would show up at lunch hours on the streets or at malls.
And the police behaved, who had been a very good police force, they behaved outrageously.
The police would start dispersing the crowd with all these weapons, including tear gas, rubber bullets. They would beat up everyone that they can catch.
It escalates like that. So after July 21st, protesters actually fought back.
A small minority of those demonstrators got onto what was a strategically dangerous path.
And violence escalated.
Once the violence started, it fed upon itself.
If we use violence, we will forfeit the moral authority we have. It's a moral authority we can get behind our advocates for freedom.
And after that, the government came and says, okay, we'll postpone the legislation until further notice.
It's significant that, Jimmy and my father and others, for 30 years, they kept and led the Tiananmen Vigil in Victoria Park.
They've had vigils ever since then, which are a real sore spot for China.
These were always sores in Beijing's eyes. The first opportunities they got to take these eyesores, they took it. The Hong Kong authorities used the excuse of the COVID-19 to begin denying people the permit to organize, to protest. Jimmy Lai and other people, they show up at the Victoria Park at the candlelight vigil.
Now the possibility of putting me in jail is more probable than before.
What circumstances does Jimmy Lai get out of Hong Kong?
I would not get out of Hong Kong because I'm one of the troublemakers. I can't make the trouble and let go. I cannot do that. Well,
So the Hong Kong government withdrew the extradition bill under pressure, but the issues that gave rise to it and the resentments and the reaction to the violence and all those things were kept festering. And that's what then gave rise unexpectedly to where we are today with the national security law.
China has passed controversial national security legislation for Hong Kong in response to the pro-democracy protests that started last year.
The national security law is a very obvious example of CCP's disrespect for law.
The national security law was implemented in a way that was so ridiculous, where they didn't actually disclose the text and didn't have any input from the Hong Kong legislature and others.
The national security law was conceived by people in Beijing as an instrument to bring Hong Kong to heel.
One country, two systems.
Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong.
Abandoned the pretense that there was some differentiation between Hong Kong autonomy, which Beijing committed itself to.
First of all, it's an extremely broad and vaguely worded law.
It allows the Chinese-style rule of law to operate in Hong Kong.
It establishes a Chinese law which sets up special courts, special police in Hong Kong to capture almost any activity that the security authorities deem to be in violation of that law.
The new law criminalizes subversion and collusion with foreign forces.
But all those terms are very broadly defined, so it makes any criticism or dissent potentially criminal.
As a media person, it's impossible for media to survive because whatever we say can be sedition, can be subversion, can be anything. They name it.
This isn't a legal system in any sense that we understand, because it's a foregone conclusion. You're going to be convicted.
Which carries minimum penalty of 3 years in jail and up to life imprisonment.
And this is also one of the horrifying details. Prisoners can be sent to mainland China.
Basic human rights guaranteed under the ICCPR is not guaranteed under the national security law.
And one of the most dangerous parts of it is that it includes an extraterritorial clause.
Anyone, regardless if they are a Chinese citizen or Hong Kong residents, regardless of where they're located, if they violate the national security law, they could be pursued under the law.
Pretty much every day, sitting here in London, speaking about Hong Kong, criticizing the Chinese regime, I'm in daily violation of the national security law.
The mere fact that I'm giving this interview, if I went back to Hong Kong, I could be arrested for sedition, which is why I won't go back.
In this situation, it is essentially every single piece of the civil society is subject to crackdown. Essentially, the crackdown is total.
When the national security law came, I told myself probably it would be quite hard for me to go back to Hong Kong from then onward.
I immediately realized that as an activist who have been focusing on international advocacy, if I continue to do that, that would become a very clear violation of the national security law. And so I left Hong Kong.
I was wanted by the Hong Kong court for joining the June 4th candlelight vigil. And that's why if I now go back to Hong Kong, I will face the maximum charge under the NSR is life sentence. I can no longer contact my family. I have to give up everything in Hong Kong.
If we just surrender, we will lose the rule of law, we will lose the freedom, we will lose everything.
He knew he was in really grave danger.
How can you not be scared?
It goes to the heart of one of the things that I really genuinely admire about Jimmy, which is his conviction and sincerity.
I have long determined not to be frightened by fear. Don't think about the consequences. Do what is right.
You have every opportunity, as Jimmy Lai did, to leave Hong Kong, to go to Taiwan, to go to America, to come here in Britain. He could have done any of those things, but he stayed.
When he was arrested, he was shackled and perp walked through his own offices. He's being treated like a terrorist.
So that was really heartbreaking for me to see him being arrested, taken away by the police officers.
The 200 police actually went around the building just looking for stuff. They were collecting evidence for further charges.
His wife sent me a note, and she said they put handcuffs and chains on him to humiliate him. And I keep that photo framed by my desk to look at him every day. And I told her, I said, don't worry about that. The people of Hong Kong see them as a badge of honor. And it's a tremendously hopeful thing to watch a man that just will not give up.
I got a serious charge under the national security law, which can, transpire into my jail time in Hong Kong or in China.
It's almost certain that they will put me in jail.
It would be so boring just being a businessman. I want to make my life more meaningful and interesting, and that's why I got into the trouble I got into today, and I'm happy to have it, to be honest.
Teresa's attitude to Jimmy is, I always knew this day might come when I married you. And, excuse me. And I will walk every step of this with you.
We're very close family, but it doesn't mean that I have to put them into the same suffering that I will have to face.
I think they've both been enormously principled and brave. And I wish I could think that I would have been as brave.
This morning in Hong Kong, the police conducted their second major raid on the Apple Daily compound. The police came in this morning with about 500 individuals. Unfortunately, the first thing they did was they arrested our 3 top editorial people and 2 senior executives. They then proceeded to go through the building like a vacuum cleaner.
The second raid on Apple Daily was really about national security law. So everyone in the building was actually part of the crime, so to speak.
Our journalists were fantastic. They kept posting online through the entire thing.
As kind of the CCP takes hold of Apple Daily, their voice is actually being silenced, their social media accounts are shut down, and those tweets are deleted. Luckily, through social listening, we can capture and still see a deleted tweet. We can go back in time and see the firsthand experiences of what they were pushing out.
The police, we've learned that they've seized all the bank accounts for Apple Daily. And that's where we're at today. And I'm actually monitoring it as we go on, and I'm working on it.
I have no doubt that part of the personality of the DNA of Apple Daily is because of the DNA of Jimmy.
People, the entire Apple Daily staff, they were so determined to keep the paper running so long as they had the resources to do so.
And I will use my own money to support it. Luckily, I still have some money.
We had enough money to survive for a few years, so I don't know how they could close us down.
Jimmy Lai's personal accounts, they were also frozen.
By the end of June, we couldn't afford even to pay for the ink, the electricity, for running the printing press. You know, you run out of oxygen, just die like that, suffocate. Our colleagues decided we will still work until the very last day, until we run out of paper, run out of ink, run out of electricity. We have a little balcony, and they saw supporters outside. And they took their cell phone out and waved back to them with this light on. It was very moving. It was very emotional.
You had folks tweeting, they're closing down Apple Daily, they're printing as many as they can. And in the middle of the night, people were lined up around the block to get the last papers.
I went to the street and buy a copy of Apple Daily. Everybody was going to buy an Apple Daily newspaper.
Yes, I did go out to get a copy for myself.
I did get a copy of the last Apple Daily. There are lots of disappointment and resentment in the society because we cannot find a channel to express ourselves, and the government is not listening.
Your voice is no longer important. The government, they don't need your voice.
We lose the freedom of press, and we lose a newspaper who stands for Hong Kong people forever. I just felt like it felt like an end. I'm not sure whether that end means the end of Hong Kong or just the end of freedom of speech, but to be honest, it feels like the end of Hong Kong.
I think things are going to be worse in Hong Kong before they're better, and that breaks my heart.
Most of us cannot plan for the future. I have no idea what my future in Hong Kong would look like.
The rational choice would be to leave Hong Kong.
People who are competent and people who have independent thoughts are leaving the city. They are leaving.
And we can see that the city itself is dying.
Very sad.
The hope was that China would evolve in that 50 years to catch up to where Hong Kong is. That has obviously been reversed.
Now China's just erasing the distinctions, erasing the advantage Hong Kong had in rule of law, in market openness, in lack of corruption.
So I think it's a much more dangerous place and a much more unreliable place to be doing business.
We can't wait for the 50 years. The one country, two system is going to end very soon.
And we're less than halfway through that period, and China effectively has torn up that treaty. They say that it's a historic document of no relevance.
A China that does not respect the right of its people will not respect the right of its neighbors. That is the trouble we are facing.
Look, I hate to say it, our guys on Wall Street, are not helping the cause of freedom.
We have traded a lot of the leverage that we had, almost all of it.
We've certainly allowed our economies to become too enmeshed. Too many people in the West still have significant financial interests in Hong Kong.
A lot of these US banks in Hong Kong, international businesses in Hong Kong, have to be subject to much closer scrutiny.
International centers of finance and international cities don't take political prisoners. Those things don't go together.
With the national security law, the authorities can request, for example, Google, Yahoo, WhatsApp, Apple to hand over user data and corporate data.
Chinese government has so much against the US government, and yet they're asking them for help to shut down an integral part of our freedom of speech.
I don't think they would care if whether the people here is living in hell or not, as long as they can make money, I guess.
This is the dilemma that the West is facing right now, is that we have to stand by our principles of free enterprise, even if it costs us something in the marketplace.
Any company who bow down to China just for profit by laying down the moral authority and integrity or dignity, that will hurt the dignity of American people.
What I would like to see is the international community doing more on behalf of Jimmy Lai. Why haven't the United Kingdom and the United States, for instance, tabled resolutions in the United Nations?
It's a great puzzle to me why Vatican, which is constantly emphasizing the rule of law in international affairs, is not more vocally concerned.
By saving Hong Kong, you're saving the value of the free world.
And the more that we disentangle ourselves and build alliances between the democratic nations in the free world, the better it will be.
Anytime that political prisoners are not mentioned, they languish in jail.
He may well spend the rest of his life in prison.
What we want to do is make it too costly.
Make sure that Jimmy Lai and all these names are always remembered, are always mentioned.
We would probably need about 100,000 more folks tomorrow asking questions on social media. That's how movements are born online.
All we have to get is to get the attention of the world focused on us.
Make whatever noises that we can.
Tell our representative, tell our congressman.
Encourage them to be aware of issues happening and to take actions to push for legislations that help defend all these values.
If I suffer for the right cause, it only defines the person I'm becoming.
The one thing that was left in Pandora's box when everything else had gone was hope. There's always hope, and Jimmy's story does give hope.
I think it's really important to hold on to hope, even if it seems extremely difficult at this particular time.
I think Jimmy's story is, in many respects, the human story, the human quest for freedom.
Jimmy and others who are in jail now demonstrate to me why I still hope and believe that Hong Kong has hope.
If they make me a symbol of resistance, whatever suffering I suffer under them will be a wonderful message for the world to pay focus here.
I just hope that someday Jimmy and the vision that Jimmy had for Hong Kong comes to fruition, because these people deserve to be free.
The more pressure I have, the greater the voice I should have, so the world will pay notice.
His story illustrates what Hong Konger means.
We consider ourselves as Hong Kongers.
It means determination.
I consider myself as a Hong Konger.
It means fearlessness.
And we never surrender.
No matter what you do to us, we will let you know what we want.
And to me, that is a Hong Konger.
I came here without anything. Anything I have is this praise. This praise is freedom gave me. I owe freedom my life.
See you again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Thank you.
谢谢.
谢谢. Thank you.
So you're asking about Britain's role in Hong Kong? That's kind of a long story. But yes, Britain ruled Hong Kong for 99 years.
99 years was the course of the lease, so it was 1898 that they would have taken control of the island of Hong Kong, and then leased the surrounding area from China, which is the heart of the criticism of Margaret Thatcher there. If the timeline to anyone, I don't know if anyone's beat the history, seems a little wonky because Thatcher was out of office by 1997. She was the one who set all of this in motion and made the decision that while they didn't have to give the island back, and they could have perhaps pursued a renewal of the lease, she just opted not to. And I think you have to understand the climate of the time that, by the late 1990s, even the way we talk about colonialism now, it was beginning to be very much out of fashion. The idea that Britain was still going to hold colonies anywhere just seemed kind of outrageous. So it was viewed as a fait accompli that they were going to have to return it to China.
I can't say your name, sorry. Yes,
I guess, why didn't Great Britain lease them in the first place? Why did they just take over and that was their land in Hong Kong?
I don't know why they leased the territory. That part I actually don't know. The island itself was won as part of the Opium Wars, so conflict around the area. So if you go back to the late 1800s, still when Britain was a colonial power. The exact reason for leasing territory around it, I'm not entirely certain. Perhaps it was a way of making peace with China at the time. A lot of what you'll want to understand in terms of China and the way that the Chinese Communist Party is viewed now is stability. It's provided stability for them after a long period of time of subjugation, particularly by Japan during World War II. So that's one of the things that's important to them in seeking out policy now is the continued stability and the pride that is wrapped up in all of that. But the exact reason for leasing versus just kind of claiming that territory, I'm not sure about.
Yes, Marley.
I'm sure that you can speak more on this, but to answer Amy's question earlier on why other countries didn't get involved, my thought process would that be because we still have a lot of business in China and it's a very powerful country that if you irritate the country itself and the government would be repercussions.
Yeah, so a lot of people in talking about China now will want to make comparisons to the Cold War and to the Soviet Union. And I think, like all analogies, it's useful insofar as it goes, but there's a point where it stops being useful. And I think the point where it stops being useful for understanding China is the Soviet Union was committed to a Marxist ideology, a way of running their economy. There wasn't the possibility that the United States, that other countries could really have meaningful trading relationships with the Soviet Union. They were barely providing for themselves. What makes China, to me, more dangerous and a much more complicated matter is that they were willing to surrender the doctrinaire Marxism. They weren't going to go down the same way that the Soviet Union went down, which is just as an economic basket case. They liberalized markets. They engaged in trade with other people, with other places. The theory that a lot of people operated on was liberalization in the economy was going to eventually lead to liberalization politically. There are examples of that in history. It didn't happen. In fact, if anything, we're seeing China becoming more authoritarian from a political perspective. But I think you're right. For a lot of countries, a lot of the countries that would have the power to put more pressure on China have the problem that Mark Simon pointed out near the end of the film, where they have these complicated trading relationships with it, this kind of interdependence that exists. And as a result, they are a little more cowed in wanting to deal with China aggressively. The United States has spoken up some members of Congress have spoken about some more pointed China issues. I think we are in this is very much my personal editorializing at the moment. I think we are in a period of hawkishness towards China. To me, the question is, are we going to be smart or dumb about it? Unfortunately, the last 10 years or so of American political history tells me we're probably going to be very dumb about it. I hope we're a little better, but I don't see a lot to point to that. I do want to know, we talked about a little bit about this at dinner. The most complicated relationship that exists is between the United Kingdom and China and Hong Kong. Jimmy, he has a passport. It's a British passport. It's the only passport he has. He's a British citizen. Anybody who was born a citizen of Hong Kong or born in Hong Kong before the 1997 handover is a British citizen or has British citizenship. It has been a shame and a tragedy that the British leaders and the British government have not spoken up on behalf of a British citizen who is being persecuted and imprisoned in Hong Kong right now. It's worth acknowledging, again, the complexity of that relationship given the handover. But I will say that Rishi Sunak, the current prime minister, while he has not called for Jimmy's release, has at least brought up the unfairness of the trial. Former Prime Minister David Cameron, who is now the Foreign Secretary in the United Kingdom, has called for his release. So they're a little late to the party, but I guess better that they get there now than never.
Other observations or something you saw in the movie that surprised you, that was new to you? And of course, if you have questions for producer Eric Kohn. Yeah.
Did his family get out of Hong Kong, or are they still there?
His wife, Teresa, is still there. He has 2 children. One is still there in Hong Kong. So as you'll notice, we didn't talk to Teresa. We didn't talk to anyone else in the family. We did not talk to Cardinal Zen. The reason we didn't is because they were, at the time we were making this, the people who still had access to him while he was in prison. And if they would have talked to us for this film, there was no way they were going to continue to maintain that access. Jimmy's oldest son, Sebastian, has really become an ambassador for his father's story. He testified before Congress. He has testified before the House of Parliament in the United Kingdom and in Canada. He has really become the voice for his dad. But they have chosen to stay. I really do not know what they'll choose to. The trial is largely expected to continue through most of this year, so probably sometime late summer, early fall. I think we'll probably get a sentencing. Verdict will come maybe a month or so before that. And the trial itself will probably wrap up in early April. What they're going to do after that, I'm not entirely sure. Likely, I think Teresa and her other son will join Sebastian in Taiwan, where Sebastian lives. But that brings, of course, questions of what's going to happen to Taiwan, which is now a much more of an open question than it has been in a long time. China would very much like to take over control of that, and the deterrence that has largely been created mostly by the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Given the way that the United States is spread in a lot of different places and distracted in a lot of ways, there's not a lot of certainty that we're going to actually militarily come to the defense of Taiwan if they needed it. So the one thing that Xi Jinping would be looking for is absolute certainty. He's not going to make a move on Taiwan unless he thinks it's going to absolutely work. So as long as there's a doubt in his mind, he's not going to move. But the moment that he thinks it's 100% certain, there seems to be very little reason to think he won't do it.
Seems like the protesting isn't working in terms of peaceful
based on what you've seen, are they looking to migrate to the UK? Are they looking to stay, or what's that?
Lots of people have left. There are some people there are obviously lots of people who are still left there, but some of the people that we talk to are ex-Hong Kongers. Joey Su, she actually just recently had a bounty placed on her head by the Hong Kong police. She was one of a handful of people. My friend Frances Wee, who I've done a lot of these screenings with, she's not in the film, but she's done a lot of events with us, also has a reward placed on her by the Hong Kong police. So Joey and Frances both have asylum here in the United States. In fact, Frances was the first person from Hong Kong to be granted political asylum in the United States. So it is really an absolute outrage that there's a bounty on her head from a foreign police force, given the status that she has here in the United States. But there are other activists similarly around the world who have had similar bounties placed on them. But some have just continued to live there. Some of the people that you saw, the obscured footage, I don't even know who those people were. We went through a lot to just get that footage. It was shipped to 5 different locations and uploaded to different servers, and it was already obscured, both voices and faces, by the time we got it, and we obscured it even more, try to make sure that they couldn't tell who the people were who were talking to us. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people remain, but a lot of people have fled, especially ones who had British passports and British citizenship who could get to the United Kingdom. There are efforts there to help them integrate. I actually had the pleasure of interviewing a gentleman by the name of Winston Marshall. He is the former banjo player in the band Mumford & Sons. And he is currently, one of the big things he works on is organizing people who help integrate Hong Kongers into British society. So like, just imagine you have lived your entire life here, and all of a sudden you have to go to Argentina. Do you know how to open a bank account? Do you know where to go to, the grocery store? All kinds of things that you just do naturally here that you don't have to think about. You're just dropped in a new land where you maybe speak a little of the language or maybe none at all. You need people to help integrate those people into that kind of life. So there are some really great efforts in the United Kingdom. Here on the West Coast in Vancouver, there's large Hong Konger expat communities and a lot of people doing a lot of great work to help integrate them into new lives.
Of the Hong Kongers that stayed, are they able to spread Jimmy's message like through media outlets, or are they just giving it to us?
My understanding is that there's not a lot. There is some underground media. It is not pronounced. China, unfortunately, is very good at this kind of repression, at this kind of holding people down. So what is unique, of course, in the case of Hong Kong is, as Simon points out in the film, these are people, and as you pointed out as well, these are people who've known freedom. Like a lot of them lived a different life at one point. So there are probably activists like that. It's kind of hard to know who they are. The same way that I hear questions asked sometimes about, like, was there a Gandhi or something like that in Nazi Germany? And part of the answer is we don't know, because if there was one, they got put into a prison or a camp very early on. So the need to keep activism very quiet, very on the down low is there. But I understand there is some sub-rosa communications, some media, some passing around of stories. And the Hong Kong people are following this trial. It is covered in media there. A number of the publications are very much run by the Chinese Communist Party or influenced by the Chinese Communist Party, but there are some that are reporting on it in a more fair way. So they get some of the story, but for the most part, it's as I understand it, is a much different environment now, very much a different environment.
Nathan?
Is China making it at all difficult for average people in Hong Kong to leave?
It depends on who. Higher profile people would draw more attention. So even their calculus is a bit of a give and take of like, there's some people that is just like, please be gone. They're not allowing mass exoduses, to my understanding. People who have a passport that could get out to someplace else. So if you're older, if you have a British passport like that, it's a little bit easier. This was a little bit baffling to me, and this is going the other way. So Father Sirico, who you saw in the film, who's our co-founder, this was at our company Christmas party, where he mentioned, is like, I want to go. Go where? I want to go and watch a day of the trial. Like, I was kind of baffled when he suggested this to me. He went. And I was surprised at the ease he had. So I have a hard time reading the tea leaves of exactly like what they want to do with people sometimes. Like they could crack down all in one fell swoop if they wanted to. But you see, as we document, this has been slowly implemented over time. While they did start backing away from the promises they made very early on, it has been rolled out over time. And even some of the things that people protested against have been pulled back. In some cases, hard to leave. In some cases, less hard to leave. It kind of depends. But the people who have wanted to get out and can get out easily have largely left by this point, as far as I understand it.
So I just want to say, Father Sirico's obviously in violation of security law by producing, or by his organization sponsoring this documentary. They could arrest him.
Me too. Yeah. It's funny. I had we did a screening in Sacramento, California, where the host asked me, like, how many times have you watched this film? And like, oh my God, I don't even know. If you want to count how many times we watched it in the editing process where I was giving notes, by that point, it was probably like 100, 125. And I don't remember how many times I'd seen it before it clicked to me that Benedict Rogers from Hong Kong Watch in the United Kingdom, who says, every day sitting here criticizing what is going on in Hong Kong, I'm in daily violation of the national security law. And there was one of the times I'm at one of these screenings, I don't even remember where I was, where I'm just sitting there watching it, and it just hit me like, oh crap, me too. So I can cross China and Hong Kong off of my travel list. Anywhere that would extradite me to China or Hong Kong is crossed off my travel list, but any place that would extradite to China is not really high on my list of places to go in the first place. But Father Sirico, I think, benefited from the fact that he was, I think I mentioned this earlier, he's a Catholic priest, he has Italian citizenship, and he has American citizenship. So I think the Chinese figured, like, let's not piss off 3 sovereign entities at the same time. But other people, there's the airline was offering, in an attempt to reignite tourism after COVID, free plane tickets to Hong Kong and back. And my advice to people was always, watch what you say. Like, there's just, you see these stories of, was it Otto Warmbier, I think was his name, was imprisoned in North Korea. These governments will have no compunction about taking people who create problems over their prisoner. So I'd be very cautious about, going to visit a place like Hong Kong right now, or especially going to visit a place like China, going to Beijing.
It's so different. When I was your age, I was in college, and China was opening up. And maybe I'll say this a little bit in defense of Margaret Thatcher.
Sure.
We had people like Milton Friedman, whose essay you read, and he was saying economic freedom inevitably leads to other freedoms and political freedom. And as a young and idealistic college student, I believed that. I believed that China was on a path to not only economic, but also civil liberties. And the expectation was that this was inevitable, that once you create people like, successful people like Jimmy Lai, Jack Ma, others, people with influence, people with some kind of voice, they're going to, push for extending freedom. And so far, the Chinese government has been so effective at silencing them that I no longer believe that.
And importantly, usually a middle class, like the creation of a middle class that will demand those kinds of political rights is incredibly important to those kinds of movements. I think Tiananmen Square really was a key moment, because that seems like you're going in one path or the other, and the ability to clamp down on Tiananmen Square. There's, another narrative where the Tiananmen Square protests lead to more protest and more uprising, and the demands that the Chinese Communist Party relinquish some of its control. You get some form of democratization. Back to my point earlier about the stability that the CCP provides. A great China expert at the American Enterprise Institute, Oriana Schuyler Mastro, I heard her make the point that if we see any kind of liberalization in China, any kind of implementation of more democracy, it's not likely to come in inter-party competition. It's likely to come in intra-party competition. The idea that the Chinese Communist Party is just going to get thrown out is unlikely because of that guarantee that it has stood for of stability and safety for the people. But a more liberalized version, kind of the same way that you had somebody like Gorbachev and you get something like perestroika in the Soviet Union, that is a liberalization within the party system. So the typical way that we would think of like parties competing against each other, or factions competing against each other, I think we're more likely to see it within the Chinese Communist Party itself. There are no signs of that right now. I want to be clear about that. Like, Xi is claiming more and more power for himself. He is actually at the end of his term limits, and he's still in office. So that's a pretty clear message of exactly where the party is right now.
Other observations, questions? Yeah, just to elaborate, I remember when I was graduating, I was seriously considering where in the world would I want to go? Because as a person concerned with individual freedom, I thought, where can I experience it, the most freedom in the world? And at that time, it was Hong Kong. And, it's just tragic to think that if I were to graduate today, I would never go there. It's sad.
You mentioned Milton Friedman. Most people who are aware of Milton Friedman probably know him from this PBS television series he did in 1980 called Free to Choose, which is just this personal statement and explanation of his philosophy. The opening episode, he wants to show like the platonic ideal of a free market, and he goes to Hong Kong. That's in 1980, and fast forward to 1997. And that's the beginning of the process of all of that slipping away. The one other anecdote that I want to share, while I was doing one of these screenings, and Samuel Chu, who you saw in the film, I'd never heard this before. But I think it's an important thing to remember in the way that we think about international affairs. He says that Hong Kongers have kind of a half joke. And the half joke is that Hong Kong has only ever existed for 30 seconds. The 30 seconds in between when the Union Jack flag came down and the Chinese flag went up. Because the people who were not at the negotiating table over the handover from Britain to China were the actual Hong Kongers themselves. That's Samuel's point in there about like this, the Brits said that like, hey, we got you. And then they walk away. So the forgotten people in this are the people who actually live in the city. I think you hear this a lot in the calls for the United States and Russia should negotiate an end to the conflict in Ukraine. What about what the Ukrainian people want? They're the subjects of all of this. And there's this way of thinking about foreign affairs where we make superpowers predominant and we forget the people that are actually living in the areas that are being battled over. So that for me was influential in changing the way that I thought about the kind of the way that Hong Kongers have been mistreated, even by the people who supposedly want to speak on their behalf. I think the Brits had good intentions, but they left them out of that process. And in leaving them out of that process, they empowered the people who eventually took that freedom away from Hong Kongers in the future.
Now, I just want to plant a seed in the heads of those of you who are taking this for credit. You're going to be reading an essay by John Stuart Mill in which he gives a classic defense of freedom of speech. There is a considerable minority of college students today who have said they no longer would support the First Amendment, which is the part of our Constitution, which guarantees freedom of the press, freedom to assembly, freedom of speech. It's a minority, but it's shockingly high. It's like 20%. I don't remember exactly, but to think that 20% of Americans would almost voluntarily give up what Jimmy Lai was fighting for and sacrificed his own freedom for, it's hard for me to understand. When you read that essay later this semester, think about Jimmy Lai, think about Hong Kong, think about what freedom of the press would mean for those people, and what it means when they lose it. So it's a valuable case study, I think, in support of our First Amendment rights.
It's important to remember what is intended to protect as well, right? Popular things don't need protection. It's unpopular things that need protection. It's the kind of things that bother people that need protection. That's the reason that the First Amendment exists. It's the reason is to protect minorities and unpopular viewpoints. So there are free speech radicals out there. I'm probably one of them. I'm willing to tolerate all kinds of things that I think are terrible and awful, and I want to argue against them and I want to disagree with them. But it is a very natural and human reaction to be, at least in American sense, to be very abstract about this and say like, yeah, I'm in favor of freedom of speech. And for most people, you can find some example where you're like, but not that, not that. Or even, freedom of religion, another example, if you read John Locke, John Locke is in favor of freedom of religion, but not for the Catholics. You'll find all these kinds of exceptions being made, and it takes a principled understanding of these things and the importance of that idea of protecting the things that are unpopular being the reason that these things exist. So every time you hear an opinion that drives you crazy, remember the importance of the freedom protecting that, because undoubtedly you have opinions that drive other people crazy, and you want to be able to continue to speak them. Like I continually tell people, I have a lot of opinions that make nobody happy. I am very happy that we live in a place with the First Amendment. I think everybody probably has some kind of opinion that would drive other people crazy. That's the reason the First Amendment exists.
Well, with that, we'll bring tonight's proceedings to a close. I want to thank producer Eric Kohn once more for screening.
Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.
I also want to give him a chance to tell you how you can support Jimmy Lai and what that's all about with the website.
Yeah, you set that up perfectly.
Okay.
So I've got some cards that you can take. So on these cards will be the answers to those questions. So if you want to share the film with anyone, there's a QR code where you can get the film. The film is on YouTube. It is there not only in English, but we have it dubbed in Spanish and Portuguese, as well as subtitled in traditional and simplified Chinese. There's also a QR code on here for an impact survey. It's very, very short. It's a couple of questions. If you could take a couple of minutes and fill that out for us, it would be a huge help. We had a lot of very generous people who made investments in this film that helped us make it. And this helps us report back to them on the impact that this film is having on the people who see it. So if you could take just a couple of minutes to do that. The couple other things that are on here. So number one is take the impact survey. Two, this is a bit from a previous time, but host a screening. It doesn't have to be a big organized one like this. Like send the film to friends, relatives, people you know, anybody who you think might be interested in this. Please share it. It's really important that more people see it. There's a lot of people who deride, slacktivism or hashtag activism as being some form of like just unhelpful, feel-good way of trying to do something. It is absolutely not true. As Victoria, we said near the end of the film, China would like nothing more than people to stop talking about Jimmy Lai, to stop talking. Putin would like nothing more than for people to have stopped talking entirely about Alexei Navalny. These kind of political dissidents, continuing to talk about them is important, because continuing to talk about them, the awareness that creates, the pressure that creates on these regimes is how those people get released. One more real brief story. the big flagship conference that Acton hosts in Grand Rapids every summer. 2 years ago, we were screening this film. This gentleman comes up to me after the film and asks, are you Mr. Kohn? I said, yes. He says, I have a gift for you. Older Chinese guy. I won't lie, for a moment I thought, he's gonna kill me, isn't he? Found out his name is Feng Shuo Zhang. He was a student protest organizer at Tiananmen Square. He was the number 5 most wanted man in China for a year. He spent a year in a Chinese prison. Before he was released, he spent another couple years being chased around China by the Chinese authorities before he finally was able to come to the United States. He and other activists were able to be released because of the international pressure that was put on the Chinese government to release them. China can respond in that way again, but they're not going to do it without the sense that people know about this story and care about this story. So talking about Jimmy's case, his trial's going on right now. If you go to our website, freejimmylie.com, there's more information. If you go to the website, supportjimmylie.com, there are daily recaps of the trial if you want to know what's going on there. To close the loop on the story, the gift that he had for me, and I still have to get this framed, he had 2 editions of the final week's publication of Apple Daily that he gave me. Not the final one. I'm still trying to find a copy of the final one that has that proverb that you saw at the end of the film. But just an incredible gift. And the fact that I got to meet him and that he was able to be that generous to me for really no good reason was because people knew about Tiananmen, put pressure on China, and he and other activists were able to be released. So please share that story. Grab one of these cards before you go. If you can take that survey just a couple minutes, we'd really appreciate it. But again, thank you so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it.
And once again, thank you, Eric. And
thank you.
Congratulations on a fine documentary.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to put these on the table at the back of the auditorium so you can collect them as you leave. And I'll have some up front here if you